guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about orchids which are fragrant, specifically smaller orchids that can fit into more shelves and more stands. And this is because I have a funny feeling you want to know about these things. I asked you in the post if you would be interested in a did you know regarding fragrance, and I have a feeling more of you understood a sort of a list of orchids which have a fragrance. Nope, that's not it, but because you want that, we're gonna do that today, and the did you know, which will be more of a funny facts you might not know, will be for a different time. So make sure you're subscribed to my channel just so you don't miss that video in case you want to see that too. And with that said, let's begin. The tiniest orchids in my collection, which have a nice and pretty strong fragrance. Before we start though, I just want to clarify something. This is not my list of miniature orchids. These orchids are tiny in comparison to others, yes, but they're not what I would call truly miniature. If I would have done that video, I would have probably mentioned two, because that's how many I have. So with that in mind, the first orchid that I would put on my list is the Sedirea japonica. This orchid looks like a Phalaenopsis, and it has been recently reclassified to Phalaenopsis japonica, but for those of us who are way too used to the name Sedirea, it's okay, we can call it like that. This orchid can grow to be a, let's say, medium-sized Phalaenopsis, a little bit bigger than the mini phals that you see. The flowers, on the other hand, are pretty tiny, and the flower spike is really not long and cumbersome, such as in the case of the Phalaenopsis. The flowers, on the other hand, are really fragrant. Now, of course, we are all different. Some people like certain fragrances, others don't. I'm one of those happy campers which really adore the fragrance of the Sedirea japonica, which is a good thing because the fragrance is not mild. To me, it reminds of lemon aroma, you know, the fake one that you put in cookies. It's not a pure sour fragrance, it's more of a sweet one, and whenever this orchid blooms, the entire shelf has its fragrance. It only blooms once a year, usually in the springtime. Since it is a monopodial, it is prone to producing keikis on the sides, so it can become bushier, but it will never be way too tall, such as a Dendrobium, let's say. For small shelves, I believe she's just perfect. Next small orchid on my list is the Oncidium Twinkle. This is one of the smallest Oncidiums you can have, which produces a spray of beautiful flowers that are heavily fragrant. Now, some people again don't really like the fragrance of this orchid because it is actually intense and sweet and pretty heavy. And if you're sensitive to these types of intense fragrances, well, you can have a headache, I can see that. But there are people who really enjoy the fragrance of this orchid, including myself. I love the yumminess of it. I do think I actually prefer fragrances which are a little bit yummy rather than fragrances that remind me of perfumes and soaps. Anyway, the Oncidium Twinkle comes in many different colors. You can have the whitish colored one, the yellow, the pink or red, the orange, and I think I might have forgotten something. You can have some variations between these colors. To me, they all smell pretty much the same, although some people suggest that some of them smell stronger than others. It might be true, and whenever an Oncidium Twinkle is in blue, there's just this really sweet, syrupy fragrance in my greenhouse. Pretty powerful fragrance for such a tiny orchid, and the display is also wonderful. Related to the Oncidium Twinkle, we actually have a species, and this is the Oncidium sotoanum, which is one of the parents of the Twinkle and also the cherry baby. So of course the sotoanum, which had a different name in the past, it was Ornithosincum, I believe. So at some nurseries you might find it under that name. So you can imagine this orchid has a very similar fragrance, sweet and heavy. The flowers though look a little bit different. They're pink, they're a little bit bigger than the Oncidium Twinkle, and sadly I did not have this orchid in bloom. It tried to produce a flower spike last year, but it aborted it. And I'm hoping maybe this year from this pseudobulb, which looks very nice and very plump, or maybe next year, I will have some blooms. This again is not a very tall Oncidium. If we think about the cherry baby, this really looks nothing like the cherry baby. The fragrance, I'm not sure if it will be chocolatey, but definitely it will be sweet and syrupy, reason why I purchased it. So if you ever come across this orchid, Google some images with the flowers, and if you like the flowers, then rest assured it is fragrant, it is sweetly fragrant. I forgot to mention both the Twinkle and the sotoanum bloom every time a pseudobulb is matured. They don't necessarily have a season like the Sedirea japonica. So with Twinkles, you can have them in bloom twice a year if you're lucky enough to have the proper environment. The flower spikes, though, develop very, very, very slow, sadly. Alrighty, now we're in the realm of Cattleya orchids, and sadly, true miniature Cattleyas which are fragrant, they're very rare. I'm not even entirely sure they exist. The tiny Cattleyas are Sophornides, well, what used to be called Sophornides hybrids, and Sophornides is actually not fragrant. However, we do have some medium-sized Cattleyas, such as the Cattleya mossiae, which is a species. Now, this orchid produces humongous flowers for the size of the orchid. One flower can measure almost the dimensions of a pseudobulb and a leaf. Now, bonus, these flowers look very, very pretty. They're pink, very subtle in coloring and in patterning, but the fragrance, oh my, it is pretty powerful. Now, again, I shall remind you, we're all different. We even hear things differently and see things differently, let alone smelling things differently. This orchid reminds me of lilies. It has a very flowery and beautiful scent, and most people sense it that way. But to me, it also has an underlayer of body odor, sweat, something of the sort that I don't really like all that much. But rest assured, not everybody senses this underlayer. So if you are in the happy camp which doesn't, that's perfect. However, though, it's really not that bad, and overall the flowery fragrance manages to keep that underlayer hidden. I wouldn't go for too many sniffs though. The aroma that I feel around this orchid, which is beautiful and flowery, is enough for me. This orchid only blooms once a year in the springtime, and for me it bloomed twice in April, so I think that's the month she enjoys to bloom more in my climate. And as a side note, you can actually find the alba form of the mossiae, which is a totally white flower. If you're into that, search it. It should be available from time to time at nurseries. And staying in the realm of Cattleya species, this is Cattleya walkeriana. She's a new orchid. I don't have a picture with her, and you'll notice that I will actually present orchids that never bloomed for me, just for you to have something to research. This orchid is yet again a medium-sized orchid. It will never become a huge Cattleya orchid, and the funny thing about this orchid is that it blooms on different growths. A new basal growth will form. It will not produce leaves, apparently. It will just be formed of sheets, and from the top it will produce the flowers. Now on mine, I do believe I have two new pseudobulbs forming. They're not flower spikes, but it will be interesting to film when this orchid will bloom. So this is what the articles say. I cannot say anything else from experience, but the fragrance is supposed to be one of the most beautiful and strongest fragrances in the Cattleya world. So I'm really excited to see what that will be like. It's always nice to have fragrant orchids that don't pose hassles in finding a proper spot for them. In the world of the Vandaceous orchids, we do actually have some miniature orchids, but we also have some medium-sized Vandaceous orchids, such as the Rhynchorides Bangkok Sunset, which is hands down one of my favorite Vandaceous or Vanda orchids of all times. This orchid produces a spray of tiny little flowers which are colored like the sunset, like the name suggests. It has oranges, purples, yellows, and all of this comes with a beautiful floral fragrance. Now, this is not one of those fragrances which divides people. It's just so easy to like because it's subtle, although pretty noticeable and pretty powerful. It's floral, it's not incredibly sweet, not incredibly sour, not incredibly anything. It's just there to put a smile on your face. She is really on the top of my list when it comes to fragrances. They don't all have to be very powerful and chocolatey like. Now, with time, this orchid can grow a little bit in height rather than width because she's not a wide orchid, maybe 35 centimeters across. In height, well, that will depend. After years and years, it will become pretty tall, but the wait will feel like forever, really. Vanda orchids are not fast growers, and especially Aerangis and Angraecum are the slowest Vandas that we can have. So don't worry, it will not kick you out of the house anytime soon. You can have it for 5 years easily without posing any type of issues when it comes to finding a place for it. I have mine for 4 years already, or almost 5. I don't really notice much growth. I mean, yes, I notice it, but it's not like it's something to pose any problems. I can still maintain it in the very same place without any type of issues. Speaking about miniature Vandas, here we have the Neofinetia falcata, which has been reclassified to a Vanda recently. Now, probably if you want to enter this orchid in a contest, you will have to call it Vanda falcata. If you are a grower which is not interested in contests or being very politically correct, such as myself, you will call it Neofinetia. And if you're Japanese, you will call it none of those names because you have a much more elaborate and beautiful tradition with this orchid. My point is, don't get hung up on the name, but I'm just mentioning them because you will probably find this orchid with different names available for sale at nurseries or shows. It is the very same orchid, it's just very confusing because why not? Anyway, this orchid has the most beautiful, dainty, tiny little flowers that pack a punch when it comes to fragrance. Sadly, mine never bloomed, so I'm telling you what I read on the internet right now. It is actually common knowledge that this orchid has a beautiful fragrance. It only blooms once a year, typically in the springtime, and the cluster of blooms is actually pretty big if you compare it to the tininess of this orchid. Now, this orchid will not grow super tall, but it will develop on a horizontal level. It will produce a lot of keikis, a lot of growths. As you can see, mine already has a few, which in turn will bloom and in years upon years will create a magical and beautiful show. Now, if only it will bloom. In the world of pendant dendrobiums, well, there aren't many tiny dendrobiums which pack a punch when it comes to fragrance. However, though, the Dendrobium parishi, which is a species, does. Now, this is not a miniature orchid. It can grow pretty long, but if you compare it to the anosmum, it really stays a lot tinier. The flowers look almost identical, and what you see here is actually a hybrid between the parishi and the anosmum. This is Dendrobium nestor. Flowers and fragrance are just almost identical. The difference is the parishi absolutely does not grow as long as the anosmum, which can grow to over 1 meter long, each cane. So you can imagine you'll have some issues finding a place for it. The parishi is the tiny version of that, even though it's not a miniature. The canes will grow to maybe 30 centimeters, maybe a little bit more. If you look at pictures on the internet, you will see that you don't really have parishis which are super long, 1 meter long. So that's a little bit more manageable. Now, the fragrance of this orchid is described as raspberries, and I've always tried to sense it as that, and I guess I can see why people think it smells like raspberries. And in my best days, I can actually see it, maybe more like raspberry jellies. To me, it actually smells more like a Christmas tree. I don't know why, it has that quality that gives it a little twist. My boyfriend thinks it smells bittersweet. He's actually not that good with fragrances, so it really is somewhere in between. This is also not a very mild fragrance, and some people actually find it repulsive. So maybe it really is that bitterness that makes it unappealing, but for the vast majority of people, it's really appealing, really nice. People say it smells like raspberries. I don't really think so, but that is actually up to you to discover. If you like the description of bittersweet, then definitely go for it, and if you want a tinier version of the anosmum, go for the parishi. And lastly, we have two orchids that again did not bloom for me, but I think are well worth a look. Two Angraecoids, the Aerangis and the Angraecum. In my case, I have the biloba and the leonis. Both of these orchids are fragrant during nighttime. Mind you though, not all Aerangises are fragrant, but I believe all of the Angraecums are. They produce lovely white flowers with a big fragrance during nighttime that sadly I cannot describe. And although with the Angraecum you can find big specimens, you can also find small to medium-sized Angraecums. One of them is the leonis. Mind you though, there are two versions of the leonis apparently. One that comes from Madagascar, which grows to a total width of about 10 centimeters or around 6 inches, and one coming from the Comoro Islands, which grows a lot bigger, about 20 centimeters in diameter, which makes it about 14 inches. And I shall link you down below to the article that specifies this. Also, the Angraecum magdaleni is tinier. They're all supposed to be very fragrant and nighttime fragrant. So that's about it for today for the tiny orchids which have a nice fragrance. As you can see, I don't really have a lot of them which can remain tiny and have a beautiful fragrance. There is actually a trick you can do. This works especially with Phalaenopsis, with the summer blooming species. You can purchase a younger orchid which will bloom. They're actually known to bloom when they're very young, and keep it for a few years before it actually transforms into a monster. The summer blooming Phalaenopsis species have extremely slow growth, so you can have it for a few years, but rest assured that many of them will actually grow bigger, if not huge, then maybe a medium-sized orchid. Now, if you know of other small orchids which have a beautiful fragrance, let us know down below in the comments section so we can all learn from each other. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you did, you know the drill. Give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!